Sophia stared at her phone screen, unblinking. The cold glow of the message felt more surreal than any nightmare she had ever had. I changed the locks. Your things are in bags outside. Don't come back. She read it again, trying to process. 12 years of marriage, 12 years of fighting alongside a man who, in the end, saw her as disposable. The second text arrived before she could even fully absorb the first. By the way, don't even think about the apartment. It's mine. You signed the paperwork last month. Check your documents. Except she hadn't signed anything. The air around her felt heavy, the scent of freshly baked dough suddenly making her stomach turn. The professional kitchen, where she had been finishing an important order, now seemed too small, too suffocating. But what Daniel didn't know was that she had seen this coming. 3 months earlier, Sophia had noticed the first signs. The way his tone sharpened whenever money was discussed. The sudden secrecy around bank statements. The repeated attempts to rush her into signing routine paperwork without explanations. But the real red flag was his newfound interest in selling the building where her kitchen was located, a space he once claimed was not worth much. She knew something was wrong, and silently, she started preparing. She consulted a lawyer, hired an accountant to review their finances, and discreetly installed a camera in their home office. And that's how she uncovered everything. The man who shared her bed, who claimed to love her, was forging her signature, trying to erase her from his life without a trace. That night, Sophia didn't go home, not that she had a home to return to. Instead, she drove to the only place she still had control over, her kitchen. She sat in the back office, surrounded by invoices, delivery schedules, and the faint smell of vanilla and melted butter. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, but inside, she was burning. Daniel thought he had played her, thought he had neatly boxed her out of their shared life. But what he had underestimated, what he had always underestimated, was her. He had spent years dismissing her work as a hobby, ignoring the late nights, the strategic partnerships, the way she had built something from the ground up while he assumed she was merely keeping busy. And now, he believed he had one. But Sophia had been preparing for this moment long before he sent those texts. She had already gathered proof. The lawyer had confirmed the forged signatures. The accountant had traced his financial manipulations. The security footage showed him practicing her signature over and over again, trying to perfect the fraud. And most importantly, Daniel had no idea that she had kept her business finances entirely separate from their marriage. He thought he was stripping her of everything. He didn't realize she had already secured more than he could ever take from her. So while Daniel probably went to bed that night feeling victorious, Sophia sat in her office, sipping a coffee she barely tasted, waiting for the morning to come. Because tomorrow, the real fight would begin. The next morning, Sophia arrived at her lawyer's office before the sun was fully up. She was running on nothing but caffeine and adrenaline, but she felt more awake than she had in months. As she sat across from her attorney, they laid everything out, every document, every screenshot, every piece of evidence that showed exactly what Daniel had done. Fraud, forgery, financial manipulation. He had thought he was untouchable, that his position at the law firm made him smarter than everyone else. But he had been sloppy. He had left a trail, and now, she was going to use it. Her lawyer filed an emergency motion to freeze all their joint assets before Daniel could move any more money. The legal wheels were already turning, and by the time Daniel woke up, he'd find himself in a situation he never expected, losing control. But Sophia wasn't just playing defense, she was going on the attack. While her lawyer handled the legal battle, she made her own moves. She reached out to the real estate developer Daniel had been conspiring with, casually mentioning that she was well aware of the fraudulent documents. The panic in the developer's voice was almost satisfying. She didn't need to threaten him, just letting him know she was onto them was enough. Deals like theirs thrived in secrecy, and now that secrecy was gone. By noon, she had confirmation that the sale of her kitchen's building had been put on hold. Daniel's plan to cut her out had officially started falling apart, and he hadn't even seen it coming. By the time Daniel finally realized what was happening, it was too late. His bank accounts were frozen, his carefully orchestrated plans were unraveling, and his reputation was starting to take a hit. Sophia didn't need to hear his reaction to know he was furious. She imagined him pacing in his office, calling his contacts, demanding answers, trying to figure out how things had slipped through his fingers. But she didn't care. For the first time in years, she wasn't reacting to him. She was ahead of him. And she wasn't stopping. Her lawyer informed her that an ethics complaint had already been filed against Daniel at the Bar Association. Fraudulent signatures weren't just an issue in their divorce proceedings. They could cost him his entire career. He had gambled everything, assuming she was too naive to fight back. And now, the consequences were rolling in. The court date arrived faster than Daniel could prepare for. He walked in with the arrogance of a man who had always won, wearing the expensive suit that once symbolized power. But power wasn't in his hands anymore. As Sophia's lawyer presented the evidence, bank records, emails, security footage, his confidence started to crack. When the judge examined the proof of forgery, his jaw tightened. And when the real estate contracts were exposed, showing his attempts to cut Sophia out of her own business, his face drained of color. The final blow came when the judge announced that all their shared assets would remain frozen until a full investigation was completed, and that, due to the fraudulent nature of the apartment transfer, the property legally remained Sophia's. In a matter of minutes, the life Daniel had meticulously crafted for himself began to crumble. Sophia sat through the proceedings with an expression of quiet resolve. She wasn't here for revenge, at least, not in the way Daniel might have thought. She was here to reclaim what was hers, to make it clear that she was never the clueless, submissive wife he had assumed she was. As the judge delivered the final ruling of the day, Daniel barely looked at her. He kept his gaze on the table, gripping the edges like he could hold on to what little control he had left. But there was nothing left for him to hold. His firm, already aware of the allegations, had placed him on immediate suspension pending the investigation. The same law degree he had always lorded over her, the career he had prioritized over everything, including their marriage, was now the very thing that would bring him down. When court adjourned, Daniel walked out stiffly, his movements robotic. Sophia didn't follow. She had no more words for him. Instead, she exited the courthouse with her lawyer, stepping into the crisp Sao Paulo afternoon. The weight on her chest that had been there for months, maybe years, felt lighter. There was still a long road ahead, but she had already won the battle that mattered most. She had proven to herself that she was stronger than he ever gave her credit for. As she turned on her phone, a flood of messages came in, staff updates from her business, emails from new clients, a call from a hotel chain interested in a long-term partnership. Life was still moving forward, and now, nothing was holding her back. That evening, Sophia didn't go home, because now, home was truly hers again. Instead, she went straight to her restaurant. The moment she walked through the doors, the familiar hum of the kitchen, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables, and the scent of warm spices wrapped around her like a long overdue embrace. Her staff greeted her with cautious smiles, unsure if they should celebrate yet. She wasn't the type to make a scene, but tonight was different. She grabbed a bottle of wine from the shelf, popped the cork with a practiced flick of her wrist, and poured a generous glass for herself. To new beginnings, she murmured, lifting the glass toward the ceiling before taking a slow, satisfied sip. She walked through the kitchen, watching her team work, each person moving with precision, just as she had trained them. This place was built on her sweat, her sacrifice, her talent. Daniel had never understood that. To him, success was measured in titles and prestige. To her, it was in the way people closed their eyes after the first bite of her food. In the deals she had secured with nothing but determination and skill. And now, she didn't just have her business, she had complete ownership, legally and emotionally. Daniel had tried to take everything from her, but all he had really done was set her free. Days turned into weeks, and while Daniel's life unraveled, Sophia's only got bigger. Word spread quickly in the business world about the lawyer who had tried to scam his wife and ended up losing everything. His firm officially cut ties with him, and whispers of disbarment loomed over his head. Meanwhile, Sophia's catering business was thriving more than ever. The scandal had unintentionally brought her more exposure, and high-profile clients reached out, eager to support the woman who had outsmarted her husband in court. Some called it poetic justice. She just called it survival. She had spent years working twice as hard to be taken seriously, and now, for the first time, she didn't have to prove herself to anyone. She was exactly where she was meant to be. One afternoon, as she finalized a contract with a luxury hotel, her phone buzzed with a message. A name she hadn't expected to see, Daniel's sister. The text was short, almost hesitant. "Mom's birthday is next month. She wants your food. Can we talk?" Sophia stared at the screen for a long moment, a slow smile spreading across her face. Of all the victories she had won, this one was particularly sweet. Daniel had spent years believing he was the only one who mattered. The only one with real influence. Yet here she was, still standing, still thriving, while his own family turned to her, not him. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she finished signing her contract, savoring the moment. Success was sweet. But this was priceless. Sophia didn't rush to reply. She let the message sit there, much like Daniel had let her sit in uncertainty for months, thinking she was powerless. But she wasn't that woman anymore. Instead, she focused on what mattered of her. Business, her future, the life she was building on her own terms. Later that evening, as she closed up the restaurant, she finally typed out a response. "Of course. Send me the details." Short. Professional. No emotion. She knew the request wasn't just about food, it was an unspoken acknowledgement of everything that had happened. Daniel's mother had always liked her, always respected her talent, even when Daniel dismissed it. And now, even his own family recognized who had truly built something lasting. The night of the event, Sophia personally oversaw the final touches on the catering setup. She hadn't planned on attending, but as she watched her staff move with efficiency, arranging platters of beautifully prepared dishes, something inside her shifted. Why shouldn't she go? This was her work, her reputation. She had spent years standing in Daniel's shadow, letting him take the spotlight while she did the heavy lifting in the background. Not anymore. So, with her head held high, she stepped into the venue, not as someone's wife, not as an afterthought, but as the woman who had built everything in that room with her own hands. The moment Sophia walked in, conversations dipped for a brief second, just enough for her to notice. Some people looked surprised to see her, others offered polite nods, avoiding eye contact. But she didn't care. She wasn't here for their approval. As she made her way through the room, she caught sight of Daniel, standing stiffly by the bar, his drink untouched in his hand. He had seen her the moment she arrived, she could tell by the way his jaw clenched. For the first time in their history, he wasn't the one controlling the narrative. She was. And nothing about her presence screamed the woman he left with nothing. Quite the opposite. She was thriving, and it showed. His mother, oblivious to the tension, beamed when she saw Sophia. "You came. I told Daniela I didn't want anyone else's food. You know how I feel about your cooking." The warmth in her voice wasn't just about the food, it was about Sophia herself. A quiet, undeniable confirmation that no matter how hard Daniel had tried to erase her, he had failed. Sophia smiled, steady and unshaken. "Of course. I wouldn't miss it." And as she looked around at the event, the one catered by her company, filled with people enjoying the success Daniel had always dismissed, she knew, without a doubt, that she had already won. As the night went on, Sophia moved through the event effortlessly, making sure everything was running smoothly. Guests raved about the food, some even asking for business cards, completely unaware, or perhaps pretending to be, that this was the same woman Daniel had tried to destroy. She wasn't just surviving. She was expanding. And that fact was impossible to ignore. Every now and then, she could feel Daniel's gaze on her from across the room, but she never once looked in his direction. He had become irrelevant in a space where he once believed he held all the power. At one point, she stepped outside for a moment of fresh air, the cool breeze hitting her skin as she exhaled. She didn't feel anger anymore. She didn't even feel the need for revenge. What she felt was something even better, freedom. She had spent years shrinking herself, making herself smaller to accommodate Daniel's ego. But now, she took up space. She was fully, unapologetically herself, and there was nothing he could do about it. When she turned back to go inside, she caught a glimpse of him near the entrance, his expression unreadable. For a brief second, their eyes met. But unlike before, it wasn't Sophia who looked away first. Sophia didn't linger. She had nothing left to say, nothing left to prove. She walked past Daniel as if he were just another guest at the event, someone unimportant, someone whose presence no longer held weight in her life. And that, she realized, was the final victory. He had tried to break her, to erase her, to take everything she had built. But she was still standing. Stronger. Wiser. Untouchable. As she re-entered the venue, she felt lighter, as if she had shed the last remnants of the past that once held her down. By the end of the night, as her team packed up and guests said their goodbyes, Sophia stood near the exit, shaking hands and exchanging smiles. She didn't look for Daniel, she didn't need to. He had already seen everything he needed to see. He had watched her rise from the wreckage he thought would bury her. And now, for the first time, he was the one left behind. As she stepped out into the night, the city lights reflecting in her eyes, she knew one thing for certain: she was never going back. Not to him. Not to that life. Not to the version of herself that thought she needed his validation. She had built something greater, something lasting. And this? This was just the beginning. The drive home felt different that night. For the first time in years, Sophia wasn't carrying the weight of someone else's expectations. She wasn't replaying arguments in her head, wondering if she should have spoken up more, fought harder, or tried to make herself smaller to keep the peace. That version of her was gone. She had fought, not just in court, but for herself, for her future, for her business, for her dignity. And she had won. As she pulled into her building's parking garage, she took a deep breath, letting the reality of it all settle in. The apartment, the one Daniel had sworn was his, was now legally and undeniably hers. She stepped out of the car, walked into the lobby, and pressed the elevator button with a quiet certainty. This was home. As she entered the apartment, the silence greeted her, but it wasn't the lonely kind, it was peaceful. She kicked off her heels, poured herself a glass of wine, and stood by the window, overlooking the city. The same city where she had built everything from the ground up, where she had been underestimated, overlooked, dismissed. And yet, here she was. Still here. Still. Thriving. She took a slow sip, the wine rich and smooth against her tongue, and let herself savor the moment. This wasn't about Daniel anymore. It had never really been about him. It was about her finally stepping into the life she had always deserved. And for the first time in a long time, she smiled, not out of relief, not out of defiance, but because she was genuinely happy. The following morning, Sophia woke up feeling something she hadn't in years this home. No tension in her shoulders, no anxiety about what battle she'd have to fight next. Just quiet certainty. As she got ready for the day, she glanced at her phone, expecting another wave of emails and work updates. But one message stood out. An offer. A well-known investor in the restaurant industry had heard about her story, about the woman who had outmaneuvered a powerful lawyer and still came out on top. He wanted to meet, discuss expansion opportunities, and potentially back her in opening a second location. She exhaled, shaking her head with a smile. What Daniel had once mocked as a hobby was now catching the attention of serious investors. The irony was almost too perfect. Later that afternoon, as she sat in the investor's sleek office, she listened carefully, weighing her options. She had spent so long proving herself, fighting to be taken seriously, that the idea of having real financial backing felt surreal. But she knew one thing: whatever decision she made now would be hers alone. No one would rush her, manipulate her, or make her feel small again. As the investor finished his pitch, he leaned forward with an easy smile. "So, what do you think? Ready to take this to the next level?" Sophia took a breath, letting the words sink in. A year ago, she might have hesitated. But not now. Now, she was exactly where she was meant to be. She looked him in the eye, steady and confident. "Let's talk details." The meeting stretched into the evening, filled with discussions about locations, branding, and logistics. It wasn't just about opening another restaurant, it was about scaling what she had built, turning her vision into something bigger than she had ever imagined. As she left the office, walking through the bustling streets of Sao Paulo, she felt it again, that weightlessness, that undeniable sense of control over her own future. She had spent years tied to someone who had tried to convince her that she was less, that her work was secondary, that she existed in the background of his success. And now, here she was, making business moves on a level Daniel had never believed she could reach. Back at her restaurant, she gathered her team for a late-night meeting. They deserved to hear the news first. As they sat around the stainless steel counters, their faces expectant, she took a deep breath. "We're expanding," she said, and the room erupted into cheers. Some clapped, others hugged her, and she saw something in their eyes that meant more than any court victory ever could by belief. They had always known her worth, even when Daniel hadn't. She wasn't just their boss, she was the person who had built this from the ground up, the one who had fought for all of them. And now, she was taking them to the next level. As the excitement settled, Sophia looked around the kitchen, taking in the faces of the people who had stood by her through everything. Some had been there since the early days, back when she was still struggling to prove herself, working grueling hours just to keep the business afloat. Others had joined later, drawn in by the reputation she had built, by the work that Daniel had once dismissed as a mere hobby. But none of them had ever doubted her. And that, more than anything, was what made this victory feel so profound. She had done this. She had built this. And no one could ever take it away from her. That night, long after her staff had gone home and the kitchen had been cleaned, Sophia sat alone in her office, scrolling through old emails, old photos, old memories of a life she no longer belonged to. She found one picture, her and Daniel, years ago, at a dinner party. She stared at it for a long moment before finally doing what she should have done months ago. Delete. The past no longer had a hold on her. She had spent enough time looking back. Now, there was only one direction left to go, forward. The weeks that followed moved fast, but this time, Sophia was the one setting the pace. Meetings with architects, negotiations for new suppliers, and endless planning sessions filled her days. But unlike before, it didn't feel exhausting, it felt right. This wasn't about proving anything to anyone anymore. It was about growth, about creating something lasting. One afternoon, as she reviewed the final contracts for her second location, her phone buzzed. She almost ignored it, but something made her glance at the screen. Daniel. The name alone made her pause. Not out of fear, not out of anger, just mild curiosity. She hadn't heard from him since the court ruling. She let the call ring out. A few seconds later, a message appeared. "I heard about your expansion. Congratulations." No apology, no acknowledgement of everything he had put her through, just that. Sophia stared at it for a moment, then simply locked her phone and went back to reviewing the contract. Daniel was the past. And she had no intention of carrying the past with her into the future. The opening day of her second location arrived faster than she expected. The restaurant was everything she had envisioned, warm, elegant, alive with energy. As she stood near the entrance, watching guests fill the space, she felt something deep in her chest. Not pride. Not relief. Something stronger. This wasn't just a business expansion. This was proof that she had been right about herself all along. That she was capable. That her work did matter. That she had never needed anyone else's validation to succeed. At one point, a journalist approached her for a quote. "You've built something remarkable here," they said. "What would you say to those who doubted you?" Sophia smiled, thinking of all the nights she had spent doubting herself because of Daniel's words. The way he had made her feel small, as if her dreams were nothing more than distractions. She looked around at everything she had created, her staff, her customers, the future unfolding before her. Then, she turned back to the journalist and simply said, "I'd say they were wrong." As the night unfolded, Sophia moved through the restaurant, greeting guests, checking on the kitchen, and soaking in every moment. The sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and the hum of a successful service filled the space. This was her world now, one she had built with her own hands, without anyone's permission or approval. And as she watched people enjoy the food she had spent years perfecting, she realized something important. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. Near the end of the night, she stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. The city stretched out before her, buzzing with life, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't looking ahead in search of an escape, she was exactly where she was meant to be. She pulled out her phone, scrolled through the dozens of congratulatory messages, and let herself take it all in. Then, with a steady hand, she deleted Daniel's last message without a second thought. Some doors weren't meant to be reopened. And hers had just closed for good. As she walked back inside, her staff greeted her with cheers, raising their glasses in celebration. The restaurant was a success, But more than that, she was a success on her own terms, by her own merit. She looked around at the people who had supported her, the business she had built, and the life that was finally, truly hers. No more being underestimated. No more living in someone else's shadow. This was her story now. That night, as she locked up and took one last look at the glowing sign of her restaurant, she felt something settle deep inside her. Peace. Not the fragile kind that depends on someone else's approval, but the kind that comes from knowing you fought for yourself and won. Daniel was just a chapter in her past. And the future? That was all hers.